The first thing the Sovereignty border checkpoint logged was an anomaly. 3 ships appeared out of nowhere in Corridor 7, which was a heavily patrolled lane between the Drethian gas clusters and the outer ring of Sovereignty territory. No one was supposed to appear there. Certainly not 3 small, battered-looking vessels with unfamiliar hull configurations and drive signatures that did not match anything in the database. Checkpoint Commander Orvan had been running border patrols for 19 years. He had intercepted smugglers, rogue colony ships, and twice a species that had wandered too close to the border and immediately started apologizing. He knew what fear looked like from the other side of a scanner. These ships were not behaving like anything he recognized. They did not scatter. They did not power up weapons. They just sat there, running what looked like sensor scans of their own, reading the area, presumably realizing where they were, presumably about to start panicking. Orvan opened a broad-frequency channel. Unidentified vessels, you have entered Sovereignty-controlled space without clearance. Cut your drives, power down weapon systems, and hold position. Any movement will be interpreted as hostile. The response took 40 seconds. Not a long time, but long enough that Orvan had already started composing his incident report in his head. Sovereignty checkpoint. This is the S-Resolute out of Earth. We read you. Drives are already cut. We dropped from FTL about 3 minutes ago. Weapons were never up, so that's not a problem. We'd appreciate a diplomatic channel when one is available. We also need coordinates. Our navigator thinks we overshot our survey corridor by somewhere between 40 and 60 light years, and we'd like to confirm that before we plot a new heading. Orvan stared at the transmission log. They wanted coordinates. He sent a query to the system AI, asking for any record of a species called humans or a planet called Earth. The AI came back with nothing. These ships were from somewhere the Sovereignty had never catalogued. He opened the channel again. Hold your position. Do not attempt to jump. A response fleet has been notified. Understood, the Resolute replied. Is there an estimated wait time? We have people who will want to eat soon. Orvan closed the channel and sat very still for a moment. On the Resolute's bridge, Lieutenant Bren Halsey had already pulled up a full tactical breakdown of the checkpoint. 4 Sovereignty patrol craft, mid-range weapons, formation set for interception, not for combat. He noted the difference. There was a big gap between ships that were ready to fight and ships that were positioned to look like they might. He passed the breakdown to Captain Dora Ose without comment. She read it, handed it back. Then she asked her communications officer to log the exchange and file a standard survey contact report, same as they'd do for any new species encounter. Routine. That was the word she used. Bren did not point out that there was nothing routine about being surrounded. He had worked with Dara for 6 years. She was not the kind of person who missed the obvious. If she was calling it routine, she had a reason. Across the small fleet on the S-Cairn, Commander Civ Allard was running the same numbers. He pulled up a blank document on his secondary screen and typed one line at the top, intimidation attempts. Then he typed the number 1 and drew a small box around it. He had a feeling he was going to need the space. The engineering bay of the Resolute was quiet except for the hum of the cooling systems. Chief Engineer Petra Sousa had spent the last 20 minutes running a full post-jump diagnostic. Everything was fine. The FTL drive was already cycling through its standard recovery sequence, which, on a ship this old, took about 40 minutes. She did not mention this to the bridge. Not yet. She pulled up the energy readings from the checkpoint ships. Their weapons were hot, technically, but barely. The targeting systems were not locked. She made a small note in her log, passive threat, no active engagement posture. Then she got back to her diagnostic. Outside, more Sovereignty ships were arriving. Orvan had called in a full patrol group, 12 vessels now, arranged in a wide ring around the 3 human ships. From the outside, it probably looked like a very effective trap. From the inside, Petra looked up from her screen. counted the new drive signatures on the proximity alert, and went back to her diagnostic. On the bridge, one of the junior crew asked quietly whether they should be worried. Dara did not look up from the contact report she was writing. "We're lost," she said. "We've been lost before. Get something to eat, we're going to be here a while." The junior crew member sat down. After a moment, someone produced a pack of ration bars from somewhere and started passing them around. The Sovereignty Patrol ring held its formation and waited for orders. The humans ate. The Sovereignty 6th Fleet arrived 6 hours later. 40 ships, 3 dreadnoughts at the front, each one wider than most human settlements, with weapon arrays that could reduce a moon's surface to glass in under an hour. The patrol ring that had been holding the humans in place looked small and a little embarrassed by comparison. Admiral Roth Vashon ran the 6th Fleet with the understanding that his job was not to fight. His job was to make fighting feel so obviously pointless that no one ever tried. In 40 years of service, he had made 11 civilizations stand down without firing a single shot. The method was always the same: arrive, display, demand, receive. He had never needed a fifth step. He opened a fleet-wide broadcast on every frequency his communications officer could find. The speech was one he had given before, refined over decades into something close to an art form. The sovereignty's age, its reach, the number of species that had tried to resist it and failed, the specific and detailed consequences of further noncompliance. He delivered it without rushing. The weight of it was the point. When he finished, there was a pause. Then the Resolute replied, "Thank you for that. Could you resend the first section? Our buffer clipped the opening about 40 seconds in, something about the compression format." Vashon's communications officer looked at him. He looked back at her. He had never been asked to repeat himself. On the Resolute, Bren Halsey was watching the fleet formation with the focused attention of someone working through a puzzle. The dreadnoughts were positioned at the front, which was dramatic. It was also, from a pure targeting standpoint, wasteful. You put your biggest ships at the front for one reason: because you wanted the other side to see them. Bren had enough experience to know that ships positioned for being seen and ships positioned for actually engaging were different configurations. He did not share this analysis with anyone except Dara. She nodded once and told him to keep logging. Vashon resent the broadcast, slightly shorter. The response this time was faster. "Got it in full. We'll transmit your message to our home authority and await a response. That process typically takes several weeks. In the meantime, we're happy to maintain our current position and open a direct diplomatic line if that's useful." Weeks. They said weeks as if that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say to a fleet of 40 warships. Vashon moved to the next phase. He ordered a concentrated energy discharge, a single blast from 3 of his line cruisers, directed at open space ahead of the human vessels. Not aimed at them, near enough to show what near meant. It was a move he had used before. Species with any working survival instinct tended to respond to that kind of display with immediate capitulation. The few that didn't respond immediately responded within minutes, once the magnitude of the energy reading finished registering on their instruments. The blast went out. The light from it would have been visible to organic eyes from half a system away. In the Resolute's engineering bay, Petra saw the energy spike on her board. She cross-referenced it against the source vessels, calculated the output, then recalibrated the ship's shielding distribution to account for the new threat profile. It took her about 4 minutes. Then she flagged the event in her log as probable warning discharge, non-targeted, and got a cup of water. 4 minutes later, Dara opened a channel to Vashon. "Admiral, we saw that discharge. We want to make sure we're reading it correctly. Was that a weapons test, a system malfunction, or a form of greeting? We don't want to misinterpret something and create a problem." Vashon stared at the response for a long time. In his experience, Species that survived long enough to develop interstellar travel still flinched at displays of scale. They couldn't help it. It was biological. Seeing something with the power to end you and knowing it was choosing not to for now did something to a thinking creature. Made them small. Made them cooperative. These humans were not flinching. They were asking for clarification. Civ Allard on the cairn added a second tally mark to his document and made a quiet note next to it. Fleet arrival, 40 ships. He drew another box, smaller this time, next to the number 2. Warning discharge, no response. On the Resolute, a crew member named Holt, who ran the secondary comms console, had started a quiet pool on how many ships were in the Sovereignty fleet. He had guessed 38. He was close enough that he considered it a moral victory. Vashon composed his reply carefully. He did not answer the question about the discharge. He issued another demand, full crew manifest, ship specifications, FTL coordinates for the human home system. Dara's response came back in under 2 minutes. Crew manifests are available for diplomatic review under standard contact protocols. Ship specifications we'll share once we have confirmation that this is a formal first contact process rather than a detention. As for our home coordinates, we'd want a mutual exchange. We'll share ours if you share your own capital system's location. That seems fair. Vashon had never, in 40 years, been asked for a mutual exchange. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the 6th Fleet held formation. The 3 human ships sat inside the ring, small and undamaged, and apparently in no hurry at all. Vashon drafted a message to his intelligence division. It said, "Find out everything you can about these people." He had a feeling he was going to need it. The idea came from Vashon's second-in-command, a fleet strategist named Kurat, who had spent 30 years thinking about how to win situations without firing anything. "Send a boarding party," Kurat said. 12 soldiers, full armor, full loadout. Let them walk the ship. Let the humans feel what it's like to have Sovereignty soldiers in their corridors. Physical presence does what radio transmissions can't. It was a good idea. It had worked before on species that seemed otherwise unbothered by displays from a distance. Something changed when soldiers were in the room, when you could hear their boots on the floor and see the size of their weapons up close. Vashon approved it. The Resolute's response to the boarding request was not what anyone expected. "Approved, dock at Port Airlock 2, someone will meet you." No condition, no negotiation, no protest. Kurat reviewed the response twice. Then he told the boarding party commander, a soldier named Bale, to proceed with caution. Bale and his 12 soldiers were not small. Sovereignty combat armor added another third to their already considerable size. Their weapons were visible and large. Their helmets had full facial coverage with optical systems that processed threat data in real time. They had walked into volatile situations on 6 different planets, and every time, the room had changed when they entered it. That was the whole point. They docked, the airlock cycled, the door opened. A human was waiting on the other side. She was not in armor. She had no visible weapons. She was a medium-height woman in a gray work uniform with grease on one sleeve, and she was holding 2 cups of something that steamed. "Welcome aboard," she said. "I'm Petra. I run engineering. The captain's on the bridge if you want to talk to her, but she figured I could show you around the mechanical sections first since that's probably what you're most interested in. Do any of you drink anything hot? I only made 2 cups because I didn't know how many of you were coming." Bale processed this. "We are here to conduct an inspection of this vessel," he said, in the Sovereignty's formal contact language, which his suit was broadcasting on the external speakers. "Sure," Petra said. "I'll show you everything, follow me." She turned and walked down the corridor. Bale looked at his soldiers. They looked back at him. He followed her. The tour lasted 2 hours. Petra showed them the engineering bay, the drive systems, the life support configuration, and the secondary power grid. She talked the entire time. Her explanations were detailed, technically precise, and delivered in the same tone she would use to brief a new crew member on a Tuesday. She answered every question Bale's suit translated. She opened every panel he pointed at. She showed him the shielding output logs and the fuel consumption rates. What she did not show him, and what she managed to avoid in a way that felt completely natural, was the core navigation system, the ship's FTL initiation controls, and the main sensor array configuration. Every time Bale moved toward one of those, Petra was already somewhere slightly more interesting, pointing at something that seemed more pressing and more relevant and turned out to require a 10-minute explanation. Bale was a soldier, not a technician. He was not always sure which systems were which. By the time he realized he hadn't seen the navigation core, they were already at the end of the tour. In the corridors, the human crew moved around the soldiers with the low-key awareness of people sharing a small space. Not scared, not aggressive, just navigating. One young crew member nodded at Bale's helmet the way you might nod at a large piece of furniture that was in the way. Nobody ran, nobody whispered, nobody dropped anything. In the medical bay, the ship's doctor glanced up from a report, looked at 12 armored soldiers standing in his doorway, and asked if any of them needed anything. When Bale said no, the doctor said all right and went back to his report. Back on the command ship, Curret was watching the body camera feeds from Bale's soldiers. He was looking for the thing he always looked for, the moment when the human's composure slipped. The moment when the reality of 12 armed soldiers walking their corridors broke through whatever calm they were performing. The moment did not come. Bale's final report came in an hour after the boarding party returned. It was 3 pages long and could have been summarized in 2 sentences. The ship was fully operational. The crew was uncooperative in no way he could formally document. And something about the experience felt wrong in a way he was struggling to put into words. Curret read the report twice. He thought about the 2 cups of coffee Petra had made, and then thought about the fact that she had clearly known exactly how many soldiers were coming, and had made exactly the right number of cups to create a small social awkwardness. He added a note to the file. Crew is either very well trained or very accustomed to worse. Then he added a second note, possibly both. On the Resolute, Petra dropped back into her chair in the engineering bay, finished her now-cold cup of coffee, and updated her log. The navigation reroutes she had put in place before the tour took her 6 minutes to reverse. Then she did what she always did after a difficult task. She got back to work. Emissary Len Thurak had a record no other sovereignty diplomat could match. 43 first contacts, 43 signed compacts. He had negotiated with species that communicated through color changes in their skin, species that required 6 translators working in sequence, and 1 species that only spoke in questions and had to be tricked into making declarative statements before they could legally agree to anything. He had never failed. He boarded the Resolute alone, with a single aide, which Dara noticed and filed away as a data point. Alone meant either very confident or genuinely trying to signal good faith. Maybe both. The meeting room they gave him was small. 4 chairs, a table, no windows. Dara sat across from him. Bren sat 2 chairs down, supposedly taking notes. His actual job was to watch Len's body language and pass hand signals to Dara if anything registered as off. Len opened a case and produced the compact. It was a physical document, which itself was a choice, paper-equivalent material, dense with formal text, with a line at the bottom for signatures. The sovereignty used physical documents for first contacts because something about signing a real object made the agreement feel more binding, more final. "This is the instrument of integration," Len said. "It outlines the terms under which your people would operate under sovereignty jurisdiction, trade access, territorial acknowledgement, security guarantees, and a schedule of contributions to the Central Administrative Fund." Dara picked it up, she read it. Actually read it, not skimmed, not flipped through for highlights. She turned every page. She went back to page 4 at one point and reread something. Len waited. His aide waited. Bren appeared to be taking very thorough notes. It took 22 minutes. When she put it down, her expression had not changed. "This is a thorough document," she said. "We'll need to transmit it back to Earth for review. We don't have authorization to sign anything at this level. That goes above my pay grade significantly." Len had heard versions of this before. It was usually a stalling tactic, and he knew how to handle it. "Transmission time to your home system and back would be weeks," he said. "The Sovereignty is prepared to offer considerable accommodations during that wait, but I want to be clear. The longer this process extends, the more difficult the terms may become. Early signatories historically receive better outcomes." "We have food and fuel for 4 months," Dara said pleasantly. "We're in no rush." Len adjusted. "I understand the hesitation, but consider your position: 3 ships, far from home, surrounded by the largest military force in this region of space. Pragmatism would suggest a faster resolution." Dara looked at him for a moment, not coldly, more like she was genuinely considering what he'd said. "You're right that we're far from home," she said. "But we've been far from home for a while. It's the job. And surrounded is a bit relative. Bren, how's the FTL looking?" "Ready when you want it," Bren said, without looking up from his notes. Len had not known the FTL was operational. His aide's fingers moved slightly against the table. Len shifted to his third approach. He was not unkind about it, he never was, but he laid out in precise detail what had happened to the last 4 species that had declined the compact. Not threats. History. The Sovereignty's history was long enough that the examples spoke for themselves. Dara listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "I appreciate the context. We've had a few difficult centuries ourselves. Can I ask you something? Of those 4 species, how many of them had FTL before they met you?" Len paused. "1," he said after a moment. "What happened to them?" Another pause, longer. "The process took considerably more time," Len admitted. Dara nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a number confirms something they already suspected. Then she changed the subject entirely. She asked Len whether the Sovereignty had explored the Drethian clusters fully, because the survey data they'd collected on the way in suggested there were at least 2 potentially habitable moons that didn't appear on any of the charts they'd accidentally accessed during their FTL dropout. Len blinked. "You accessed our charts?" "Only the navigational ones. Our system pulled them automatically for collision avoidance when we dropped in. We can delete them if that's preferred. We kept them because they were useful for not accidentally flying into anything." Len looked at Dara for a long moment. He was very good at reading species. It was most of his job, and what he was reading here did not fit any category he had. She was not pretending to be calm. She was not performing confidence for his benefit. She was simply a person who had a job to do and was doing it, and his presence, and the fleet outside, and the compact on the table were things that existed alongside the job rather than instead of it. He had spent 40 years learning how to make people feel small. He was not sure he had the right tools for someone who wasn't feeling small. He told her he would relay her position to Admiral Vashon. She thanked him and asked if he wanted anything before he left. They had decent ration packs and something that was approximately tea. He declined. Back on the command ship, he filed his report. At the bottom, after the formal assessment, he added a personal note that he marked confidential. It said, "The standard approach will not work here. Recommend actual negotiation." It was the first time he had written those words in 40 years. The intelligence report landed on Vashon's desk 11 days into the standoff. It was 60 pages long. Vashon read the summary first, then went back and read the full thing, then called in Kurrat and his senior analysts and had them walk through it out loud because he wanted to make sure he was understanding it correctly. He was. Humanity had been in space for roughly 200 years. Their territory covered about 40 systems, which was small. Their ships were small. Their fleet, what could be estimated of it, was small. By every standard metric the sovereignty used to measure a species' weight in the galaxy, humans were a minor presence, the kind of civilization that usually signed the compact without much resistance simply because the math was obvious. That was the first part of the report. The second part was where the analysis got unusual. The structural ratings on the 3 human survey ships, gathered from the boarding party's passive scans and from what Petra had voluntarily shown them, were not what the sovereignty expected from small vessels. Human ships were built to tolerances that made no sense for a spacefaring species 200 years in. The materials were dense. The redundancy systems were layered in ways that assumed catastrophic failure and kept going anyway. Sovereignty analysts compared the ratings to their own military vessels and came back with an uncomfortable finding. These survey ships, not warships, survey ships, could survive conditions that would crack a sovereignty cruiser. The physiological data from the boarding party's passive bioscanners was also in the report. Heart rates, stress hormone equivalents, muscle tension readings, all taken without the human's knowledge while Bale's soldiers walked the ship. The analysts had flagged the results twice because they seemed like sensor errors. The crew's average stress response during the boarding, with 12 armed soldiers moving through their corridors, was lower than a standard sovereignty civilian resting reading. Not slightly lower, significantly lower. The report's conclusion was careful and full of qualifications, but the core of it was this: humanity's behavioral profile did not match their resource profile. Species with 40 systems and 200 years of spaceflight did not have this kind of engineering or these kinds of biological stress baselines. Either something in the data was wrong, or humans had spent their 200 years doing something that produced outcomes the sovereignty's models did not account for. Kurrat said quietly, "What did they spend 200 years doing?" No one answered. On the cairn, Civ's board was at 19. He had been updating it methodically. Number 16 was the second fleet maneuver where the dreadnoughts had repositioned to tighten the encirclement. Number 17 was a frequency band broadcast from Vashan that had been, technically, a demand for updated crew information and not a threat, but the tone had been pointed enough that Civ felt it counted. Number 18 was when a sovereignty patrol craft had done a close pass on the Dagger, the smallest human ship, at a distance that was almost certainly designed to be uncomfortable. The Dagger had not moved or responded. Number 19 was this morning, when the sovereignty had begun powering up weapons across the fleet. Not all the way, just enough for it to register clearly on every sensor the humans had. Civ noted it, then sent a short message to Dara. "Boards at 19. Are we still doing 4 months?" Dara replied, "Tell Holt he can start another pool. First one to guess the exact count wins the rest of my ration pack." Civ smiled and closed the message. Back on Vashan's ship, the weapons power-up had been Kurrat's suggestion. A graduated escalation, not a threat, technically, but a demonstration that the sovereignty was moving toward one. It was the kind of move that historically produced results. Species began calculating odds at a certain point. When the calculation came up unfavorable enough, they got practical. The human's response was a message from Dara, sent to Vashan directly. It was short. "Admiral, we've noticed your fleet is running a weapons power cycle. Before you take the next step, we want you to have complete information. Our FTL has been ready to jump for 11 days. We've stayed because we thought the diplomatic process was worth seeing through, and we still think that. But if this escalates to an actual engagement, we jump, we report, and the next humans you meet will not be a survey team. We'd rather it not go that way. So would you, I think. Let's keep talking." Vashan read the message 4 times. He thought about the intelligence report. He thought about stress readings lower than a resting civilian. He thought about survey ships built to military tolerances. He thought about the fact that these 3 vessels had been here for 11 days and had not once seemed afraid. He thought about the last line, "The next humans you meet will not be a survey team." It was not a threat, technically. She hadn't said they would come back with warships. She hadn't said anything about retaliation. She had simply stated a fact about how these things tended to work, in a tone so reasonable it was hard to argue with. He called Kuret in. "Power down," he said. Kuret looked at him. "All weapons, full stand down, and get me Len Thurak." Kuret started to say something, stopped, nodded. Civ marked number 20 on the board and drew a box around it. Then he looked at it for a while, tapped the screen once, and deleted the whole document. He had a feeling the next part was going to be different. Len came back to the Resolute without the compact. He carried a plain case this time, no document box, no formal seals. Just a case with his notes, a recording device, and what appeared to be a personal snack he had forgotten to take out of the front pocket. Dara noticed it but said nothing. It humanized him, she thought, and then thought that was a funny word to use. They sat in the same meeting room, same chairs, same table. Bren was not there this time. Dara had decided this conversation should be smaller. Len looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "What does your government actually want from this?" It was the first time anyone from the sovereignty had asked them that. Dara thought about it, not performing thought, actually running through the genuine answer. "Star charts," she said. "Your navigational data for this region would save us years of survey work. Trade if the terms are reasonable and mutual, and to be left alone when we want to be left alone. That's most of it. And if we can't offer all 3. She thought again. "We'd probably try to get at least one, and we'd take whatever we could learn from the attempt and build from there. That's mostly what we do." Len leaned back slightly. "I have to ask about the other thing. You said in your last message the next humans who come would not be a survey team. What did you mean by that?" Dara looked at him steadily. "Exactly what it sounds like. We're not the only ships Earth has. We're also not important enough that our government would ignore it if we disappeared. If something happens to us out here, more ships will come to find out what. Those ships probably won't be running scientific instruments." "That's a warning." "It's a fact," she said. "I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm trying to make sure you have accurate information. There's a difference." Len was quiet for a moment. "Your species has been in space for 200 years. You have 40 systems. In our experience, a civilization at your stage either integrates early or resists briefly and integrates later. The outcomes are rarely different. What's the longest resistance you've seen?" 11 years. Dara nodded. "How long did your empire take to build?" He told her. She said, "We're younger than that, but we're still here and we're still building. I don't think your models account for what happens when a species spends their first 200 years surviving things that should have killed them." Len did not ask her to explain that. He had read enough of the preliminary intelligence summary to understand that Earth's history was not simple. What he understood less was why surviving a difficult history produced a species that was calm in the face of a fleet, rather than one that was either broken or aggressive. He decided to ask. Dara thought about it longer than she had thought about anything else. "I think it's because we spent so long with the threat coming from inside," she said. "Inside the planet, inside the species. When the danger is other humans, you can't just power up your weapons and point them outward. You have to actually figure out how to talk to each other. And then you get used to it. And then when something points weapons at you from outside, your first instinct is still to ask why and see if there's a better option." Len said quietly, "That's an unusual way to grow up." "Probably," she said. "It has side effects." The negotiation took 6 days. Len did not use the word integration once. Dara did not use the word resistance. What they built, over 6 days of actual back and forth, was a bilateral exchange agreement, trade corridors, navigational data sharing, a framework for future contact that treated both parties as having something worth protecting. It was not what the Sovereignty Compact looked like. It looked more like a contract between two people who had both read the fine print. On the last day, Len signed it first. He had insisted on that, and no one had asked why. Vashan read the final agreement from his command ship and said nothing for a long time. Kurrat waited. After a while, Vashan said, "File it, and tell the Intelligence Division to update the new contact classification." Kurrat looked at the draft classification the analysts had sent up that morning. It read, in translation, "Do not provoke. Reason, insufficient data." He thought that was about right. The corridor out of sovereignty space took the Resolute and her 2 escorts 4 hours to transit. The Sovereignty provided the route, the navigational charts for the surrounding region, and a contact frequency for future diplomatic communication. What they did not provide was any acknowledgement of how the last 2 weeks had actually gone. The humans did not need one. On the Cairns Bridge, Civ Allard had started a new document. It had no title. It had one line in the middle of an otherwise blank page, 20 attempts, 0 results. He looked at it for a moment, then saved it with a file name that said debrief notes and closed the window. On the Resolute, Bren Halsey watched Sovereignty Space shrink on the rear display and did the math in his head. He thought about the weapons that had never found the right firing angle. He thought about the boarding party that had walked every corridor and come away with less information than they'd walked in with. He thought about 40 ships and 3, and what that ratio meant if the 3 had not been inclined to make it a problem. Dara was writing the contact report. It was long. It would go to Earth, to the Survey Commission, to the Diplomatic Corps, to people she would never meet who would make decisions she would not be part of. That was fine. That was the job. She got to the summary section and thought for a moment about how to close it. She wrote, "First contact confirmed. Species calls itself the Sovereignty. Large territory, significant military capacity, established diplomatic framework. Recommend follow-up contact with full diplomatic team. Note for that team, they respond better to patience than to posturing. So do we, should be a reasonable starting point." Then she saved the report and looked at the display. Sovereignty Space was gone from the screen. Their own survey corridor was ahead, familiar and open and very empty. "Back on track?" Bryn asked. "Back on track," she said. She did not add anything else. There was nothing that needed adding.